Under the Nazi regime, hundreds of women voluntarily joined the concentration camp system. They were not passive bystanders or mere assistants. They were direct perpetrators of punishment, torture, and killings. From Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, SS female guards wielded routine and often lethal brutality. They did not come as executioners. Many of the women were ordinary employees, young people with no previous experience in the exercise of power. However, the system gave them uniforms, simple orders, and an environment where they could not be asked about their results. In the camps, they quickly learned what was expected of them and performed their roles with such efficiency that they were tried for war crimes. Who were they? What war crimes were committed in the camps? And what happened to them when the Reich collapsed? Carmen Mory, from International Reporting to the Death Block. Few of the chronicles of Nazi horrors are as puzzling as Carmen Maria Castro Molly, an educated journalist from Switzerland. She became one of the most ruthless killers of the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Her trajectory, which begins in the world of European international journalism and ends in the dark corridors of a hospital ward that has been turned into a death chamber, shows the ability of the Nazi regime to absorb, corrupt, and transform even those who initially seemed irrelevant to their ideology. Born in Bern, Switzerland on July 2, 1906, Carmen Mory was the daughter of a respected physician, Ernst Emil Moly, and Leona Castro Bischoff, who was of Filipino descent. He grew up in Adelboden, the heart of the Swiss Alps, and grew up in a sophisticated, multilingual and privileged environment. She received a meticulous education and initially pursued a career in music. Her original dream was to become an opera singer, but a botched tonsil surgery in 1932 abruptly cut that dream to an end. After losing her voice as a profession, Molly turned her life to journalism. She moved to Berlin, one of the cultural centers of the interwar period, and found herself in the vibrant media world. She worked with the Erstein News Agency and the Manchester Guardian newspaper and made connections in the diplomatic, intellectual, and editorial circles. By that time, she had mastered multiple languages and had an extraordinary ability to move freely in an international environment. However, in 1934, when the Third Reich was fully established, her career caught the attention of the Gestapo. A high-ranking SD officer, Bruno Sottler, recruited her as an informant. Molly possessed characteristics that made him ideal for espionage, such as foreign nationality, language acquisition, and ease of infiltrating political and cultural circles. In the years that followed, she worked as an undercover agent in France and Switzerland, monitoring networks of German exiles and observing anti-Nazi movements while pretending to be a correspondent. Her spy career came to an abrupt end in November 1938 when French authorities arrested her in Paris. He was sentenced to death on April 28, 1940, on suspicion of espionage, but just 6 weeks later, on June 6, she was pardoned. The circumstances of this amnesty are still unknown, but it is assumed that she offered to cooperate as a double agent, which was accepted by French intelligence in the conditions of an impending war. The German occupation of France put her in an ambiguous position. Freed by the Gestapo, she was met with distrust rather than honor. The Nazi authorities suspected that Molly had collaborated with the French, which positioned her as a potential traitor to them. Instead of reinstating her to espionage, they decided to imprison her. In 1941, she was sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. However, unlike other political prisoners and ordinary prisoners, her case was treated exceptionally. She was not sent to forced labor or punitive blocks. She was appointed Block Älteste, block chief of Block Number 10, where sick prisoners, many of whom were terminally ill or mentally ill, were housed. So Molly found a new arena where she wielded absolute power in the absence of effective surveillance and with extensive impunity. The position of Block Älteste was central to the internal power structure of the camp. Although formerly a prisoner, he had authority over all prisoners in the block and acted as an intermediary between the SS organization and the prisoners. In the hands of Carmen Mory, this function became an instrument of extinction. Under her supervision, Block 10 became a center of willful negligence, systematic torture, and murders covered up as medical procedures. British documents and court records collected after the war suggest that Molly was involved in at least 60 murders. She used phenol and intravenous injections of air to cause the premature death of sick women or women who were deemed useless. Sometimes they administered lethal doses themselves. He has also given instructions to other prisoners in the role of capo. These deaths were officially recorded as natural deaths or deaths from disease. In addition to murder, he also committed routine physical and mental violence. She made seriously ill women stand for hours in sub-zero temperatures, ridiculing their begging or accusing them of faking. Beat with rubber tubes, refused basic medical care, arbitrarily decided on the distribution of blankets, medicines, and food. Her words were brutal and inhuman. She called psychiatric patients biological garbage, human waste, and fallen animals. Her reputation within the camp spread rapidly. The prisoners called her the Black Angel of Ravensbrück, as an ironic contrast to the feared Angel of Death at Auschwitz. In block number 10, under her control, death was a certainty. Those who came in rarely came out alive. Molly walked between the beds as if inspecting a dying livestock, gesturing with a single gesture to those who should be eliminated that day. Testimony presented at the trial details an episode in which Molly injected a lethal substance directly into a bedridden prisoner. One of the documents included the existence of a small record book in her possession, which included her name, date, and falsified cause of death, including respiratory arrest and high fever. In the so-called internal screening program, an intermittent cooperation between Molly and SS medical personnel has been identified. The procedure was to classify sick prisoners based on their biological usefulness and apply a last resort to those deemed irretrievable. Although she was not a medical personnel, Molly played the role of logistical support and doer, making a list of those screened and hastening their deaths by injection, suffocation, or refusal of care altogether. In 1945, after the fall of the Nazi regime and the arrival of the Red Army, Molly managed to escape in the chaos of liberation. Amazingly, she used her previous experience in an international environment and her English proficiency to get a job as a British interpreter in Hamburg. However, her past quickly caught up. A former prisoner recognized her and accused her, and she was immediately arrested and taken to Lübeck for interrogation by British military intelligence. In December 1946, she was included in the first group of defendants in the Ravensbrück trial, which was held in Hamburg and lasted until February 1947. This British court tried female concentration camp officials for war crimes and crimes against humanity. At the trial, the prosecution presented documentary evidence, forged death certificates, testimonies of detainees, medical reports, and letters from inside the camp. The procedure for killing by injection, beatings leading to coma or death, as well as deliberate measures to accelerate the physical collapse of the detainees were described in detail. Molly did not deny his existence or status in the camp, but insisted that he was only following orders from his superiors and that he had no murderous intent. She was only engaged in administrative duties and claimed that the responsibility for the death lay with medical personnel. The court rejected this claim on the basis of a large amount of physical evidence and her position within the medical block. She was sentenced to death on February 3, 1947. On April 9, 1947, shortly before her scheduled execution, she was found dead in her cell. She committed suicide with a razor. Her body was ceremonially buried in a cemetery near a prison in Hamburg under the control of British soldiers. After that, no official statement was released. Gerd Beauté, the deadly shadow of the death march. Gerd Beauté represents a typical transformation from an ordinary German worker to an enforcer of Nazi terror. Born on January 3, 1921 in Teterow, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, he grew up in a working-class rural environment with no political background or ties to known extremists. He spent his childhood in a modest family environment marked by the instability of the Weimar Republic and widespread unemployment. In the early 1940s, she worked in a family-owned sawmill and later trained as a nursing assistant at a local factory clinic, where she worked mainly with workers who suffered occupational injuries. Although she was not a member of the Nazi Party, she belonged to the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the government's women's youth organization. Affiliation with this organization, which was obligatory for many German girls, indirectly linked her with the state apparatus. In 1942, as part of the final solution, the regime stepped up recruitment of women to fill vacancies in concentration camps as the number of inmates surged. Beauté was one of those recruited. In the same year, she was sent to Ravensbrück, the main training ground for SS members, where she completed an intensive 1-month course. There he was educated on obedience norms, surveillance techniques, treatment of detainees, forced labor, and corporal punishment. This was not academic or technical training, but rapid indoctrination on the methods of the concentration camp system. The supervisor was valued for his ability to impose discipline without hesitation, ideological loyalty, and willingness to control by violent means. In October 1942, Gerd Beauté was stationed in Stutthof, 36 kilometers from Danzig. The camp served as a regional extermination camp for Polish Jews, partisans, and political prisoners. There she began working as an Ärztin, female jailer, and supervised forced labor units in the field. In the first few weeks of service, he showed obvious physical brutality. Later reports describe that she beat prisoners with her hands, with rubber clubs, and with the buttstock of her rifle. Records from the Belsen trial record that an elderly woman who stumbled during an examination was struck directly with the butt of a gun, leaving her unconscious. In July 1944, she was transferred to the Stutthof branch in Blomberg-Ost, Bydgoszcz. There, prisoners worked in ammunition factories and military depots, working for up to 14 hours in grueling labor. Beauté commanded one of the labor corps and has been identified by several witnesses as one of the most violent guards. The chain of command allowed Ärztin to exercise absolute control over groups of up to 100 women, which Beauté used to punish with beatings for any behavior deemed defiance, such as walking slowly, staring at guards, or talking while working. In early 1945, the Red Army's advance westward forced the Nazis to withdraw from several camps. Beauté was placed as an escort on a retreat march that would go down in history for its brutality. On January 21, 1945, thousands of prisoners were forced to leave Danzig on foot for Bergen-Belsen. In the harshest winter in decades, I was forced to walk more than 500 kilometers. The temperature was below 20 degrees below zero, and most people were dressed inappropriately with no gloves or warm clothing. The only food, if at all, was a piece of black bread a day. The journey lasted more than a month, followed by deaths from hypothermia, malnutrition, infections, and complete exhaustion. Beauté was armed and walked in convoy with a knitted leather whip and a Karabiner 98K rifle, the standard equipment of the Wehrmacht. She systematically beat those who stopped, stumbled, and despaced. According to the court report, he allegedly attacked the unconscious 16-year-old girl directly with the barrel of a rifle and repeatedly beat her with a club to force the woman, who had already collapsed from the cold, to walk. The bodies of those who could no longer walk were left on the side of the road and froze to death within hours. According to historical estimates, between 800 and 1,200 people died in this single march. When they arrived in Bergen-Belsen at the end of February, the prisoners' physical condition was extremely serious. Beauté was assigned to command a party of 60 women collecting firewood around the camp. The discipline she imposed followed the same standards of cruelty. The women could not stop while working. They were not allowed to rest, and if they tried to lean against a wall or sit down, they were punished with slaps, kicks, and beatings with clubs. Witnesses testified at trial that Beauté grabbed the woman by the hair, dragged her more than 10 meters into a ditch, and forced her to stand up under direct death threats. In April 1945, when the camp was on the verge of complete collapse due to a typhus epidemic, food shortages, and overcrowding, Beauté continued his punitive methods until the last moment. Bergen-Belsen, with a capacity of 10,000 people, had more than 60,000 inmates. Sanitary conditions were non-existent, and bodies were piled up without being buried. Still, Beauté took a roll call of his labor corps every day and beat those who did not show up for roll call. She was arrested by British troops on April 15, 1945, upon liberation from the camp. At that time, she was still wearing the brown uniform of an SS member. She was sent to the prison in Celle, along with other guards, and administrative staff, and interrogations began. At the Belsen trial, which took place in Lüneburg from September to November 1945, Beauté was one of the main defendants. She admitted to beating the prisoner, but insisted that it was part of her duties and that she had no murderous intent. She showed no remorse and did not deny that she had participated in the withdrawal march. The court did not accept her defense. More than a dozen witnesses identified her in certain scenes of violence in Stutthof. Blomberg equals Ost and Bergen equals Belsen. A detailed and unanimous description of her method was submitted. These include the use of whips, beatings with buttstocks, repeated kicks at women who have already fallen, and deliberate neglect for death on the march. The evidence was sufficient to convict her of war crimes. On November 17, 1945, Gerd Beauté was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She served her sentence in the prison of Reich, which was under British control. In 1951, as part of a policy of commuting sentences for a large number of inmates convicted of relatively minor crimes, her sentence was shortened and she was released from prison in December of that year after serving 6 years. For several decades, she avoided public attention, but in 2004 she voluntarily participated in a television interview for a German documentary. There, she spoke about her experiences in the camp without showing any guilt or responsibility. He insisted again that he was just following orders and that everything was part of the war. Her face and name were once again featured in the international press as a case of hundreds of women actively participating in the Nazi repressive apparatus without being adequately tried or punished for the seriousness of their actions. Maria Mandel, the Mistress of Death at Auschwitz. Maria Mandel is a figure who symbolizes one of the fastest and most brutal promotions in the Nazi extermination apparatus. It was directly responsible for the selection and murder of more than 500,000 people, a name linked to the systematization of the genocide of women at Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was born on January 10, 1912, in Münzkirchen, a small village in Austria. Her origins were poor. His father, Anton Mandel, was a shoemaker, and the family lived in poverty and did not have access to higher education or important political connections. After graduating from primary school, he began working as a tutor, servant, and cook in a wealthy family. They had no professional training or skills. In March 1938, Austria's annexation to the Third Reich opened up new job opportunities for uneducated women, especially within the rapidly expanding concentration camp system at the time. In the same year, she was recruited as an Abziehherrin guard in the Lichtenberg concentration camp. The camp was initially created to house socialist, communist, and Jehovah's Witness women. There, she received her first training in paramilitary discipline, hierarchical rules, and prisoner management. In 1939, she was transferred to the women-only Ravensbrück concentration camp north of Berlin. There, she consolidated her position as a barrack superintendent, showing a strict, very strict and obedient attitude. The ability to impose discipline without hesitation attracted the attention of SS officers. Mandel was not only efficient, but also meticulous, quick to punish, and seemingly unimpressed with pain. Her abilities were highly appreciated by her superiors as a person worthy of a more responsible position. In mid-1942, it was decided to be assigned to the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, the center of European genocide. In October of the same year, she was appointed Herrin, or chief female officer of the camp. Her duties included supervising more than 200 SS female guards, supervising more than 30,000 female prisoners, and coordinating forced labor in factories, farms, and barracks. She reported directly to the camp commander, and her signature is left on a number of official documents, including lists of detainees screened for shooting or being sent to the gas chambers. Her most decisive and fatal role was the sorting carried out on the railway ramp in Birkenau. Every day, thousands of deportees are unloaded from wagons after days of travel without food or water. There they were lined up and examined for a short time by SS doctors and camp supervisors. In the absence of doctors, Mandel commanded the column and made decisions. With a simple gesture, hand signals and words, it was decided whether women and children would be sent to the labor barracks or immediately to the gas chambers. This procedure was systematically repeated for several months, especially during the wave of mass deportations from Hungary in May-July 1944. During this period, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, most of whom were murdered on arrival. According to camp records and documentary testimony, Maria Mandel was present at about 70% of the screening during this period. She was conspicuous and feared. Those who survived portrayed her as an unchanging, distanced person, saying that she mechanically carried out her genocidal missions day after day. In addition to her supply and repression duties, Mandel introduced an insidious mechanism of psychological repression, the creation and conducting of the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz. The orchestra, made up of musically trained inmates, was used to accompany marches to labor camps, morning roll calls, and, most disturbingly, selection for genocide. While women and children were segregated to be killed, works by Beethoven, Brahms, and Schubert were played. Music created a deceptive atmosphere of control and at the same time served as a means of dehumanization. Mandel personally instructed the practice, selected the repertoire, and decided who could join the orchestra. Many members testified years later that they were forced to play music during the genocide process, forcing them to remain calm while their families and comrades were dying. One of the works Mandel requested for these events was the third movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which was played repeatedly for several weeks. Within the camp, her influence was enormous, and the orders she issued were absolute. Although her official rank was not the highest in the camp's global hierarchy, her power in the women's section was superior to that of male officers in many aspects of her duties. She examined the reports of junior jailers, authorized disciplinary action, approved internal transfers, and signed lists of women deemed useless for medical, physical, or disciplinary reasons. The severity of maintaining a chain of command among the guards themselves is also recorded. She did not tolerate disorder among her subordinates and ordered immediate sanctions for any actions she considered inappropriate. Superintendents who allowed detainees to speak in an ignorance of their turn were immediately demoted. Superintendents who did not use corporal punishment for violations were sent to detachment camps as punishment. Maria Mandel remained in Auschwitz until the end of 1944, when the gradual evacuation of the camp began before the Red Army advance. She was briefly transferred to Mühldorf, a branch camp in Dachau, where she supervised a small number of guards and inmates until the fall of the regime. In August 1945, he was captured by American troops in Bavaria. During the initial interrogation, he denied any direct involvement in the killing, claiming that his role was a clerical one. However, her name was already on the list of prime suspects in a large-scale crime. She was repatriated to Poland and tried at the second Auschwitz trials in Krakow in November and December 1947. During the trial, he was charged with crimes against humanity, active involvement in selection for genocide, coordination of forced labor under inhumane conditions, and the use of cultural resources as a means of repression. The evidence presented included official documents signed by her, transport lists, internal reports of the camp, statements of other SS guards, and the testimonies of 24 survivors, including former members of the orchestra at Auschwitz. Along with dates, names, and recorded outcomes, specific episodes were recreated and directly linked to tens of thousands of deaths. On December 20, 1947, the court convicted her and sentenced her to death by hanging. On January 24, 1948, she was executed in Krakow's Montelpisch prison along with several accomplices. She did not leave a final statement or public testament. Her body was buried without formal ceremony. Anneliese Coleman, the silent whip of Bergen-Belsen. Anneliese Coleman embodies the transformation of an ordinary worker with no political background into one of the most feared guards of the Nazi concentration camp system. She was born on March 1, 1921 in Hamburg, Germany. As a young man, he worked as a tram driver in the urban transport network of the Hanseatic city. This was a common occupation for women at the end of the war, when many men had already been sent to the front. She had no military training or experience in a suppression agency until she was drafted into the SS, but the logistical collapse of the Reich at the end of 1944 spurred a campaign to recruit women in droves to meet the growing demand for concentration camp personnel. In November 1944, she was sent to the Neuengamme concentration camp in southeast Hamburg for basic training as an Absolilin. The camp was initially conceived as a prison for ordinary criminals, but gradually turned into a forced labor facility for political prisoners, opponents of the regime, and deported Jews. The training course for the new guards was 3 weeks long and focused exclusively on discipline, uncritical obedience, and the use of corporal punishment. It did not include medical training or advanced weapons training. The training was carried out by SS personnel who taught recruits to maintain order by using intimidation and routine violence as a means of control. During this training period, Coleman was determined to have a particular aptitude for the application of corporal punishment. Her willingness to impose harsh punishments without hesitation ensured the immediate assignment of prisoners to direct surveillance duties. She was deported to Bergen-Belsen in December 1944, just as the Soviet advance began to deport large numbers of prisoners from Auschwitz and other camps in the east. There, she employed a 90-centimeter knitted leather whip that hung on her belt, often against the inmates. At Bergen-Belsen, Coleman was responsible for overseeing morning and evening roll calls, as well as internal movements between the barracks and workshops. Her use of the whip was excessive and constant. She beat prisoners for losing their balance, being late in line, or simply stepping off their feet while moving. One of the testimonies gathered during the British interrogation shows that Coleman flogged more than 20 times a day, without distinguishing between young women, the elderly, and sick women. Among the recorded victims is a Polish woman who was openly flogged for going barefoot to roll call after losing her shoes while transporting her in a wagon from another camp. The assault caused injuries to her legs and back, exacerbated by a lack of medical care. Coleman also punished them for trivial acts such as trying to pick up food from the ground, sharing food with peers, and talking without permission. In one of the best documented events, a Hungarian prisoner testified that Coleman flogged her mother for more than 15 minutes as she tried to hide her daughter in a warehouse for fear of being selected for forced labor. British medical reports, prepared after the liberation of the camp, confirmed bilateral fractures of the victim's shoulder blades, as well as bruises on the chest and legs. This punishment was witnessed by other inmates and carried out as a collective commandment. In March 1945, when the Hanover subcamp was removed, Coleman took part in one of the forced relocations to Bergen-Belsen. The forced migration consisted of journeys of up to 25 kilometers per day under extreme climatic conditions, without warm clothing, without adequate food, and under armed surveillance. Coleman walked along the edge of the pack, striking prisoners who slowed down with whips and canes. She had a metal flashlight hanging around her neck, the handle of which she also used as an improvised weapon at night. In at least 3 recorded cases, it is believed that the direct death from the assault inflicted by her during the forced movement was attributable to death. The weakest prisoners were chained to canes by clothes and hair and repeatedly beaten to prevent them from stopping. No breaks were allowed, and those who fell were left on the roadside. When Coleman arrived in Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, the camp had already collapsed. More than 60,000 prisoners were held in 1/3 of the capacity. There was no running water, food supplies were cut off, and corpses were piled up between the barracks. Typhus was spreading out of control, killing more than 300 people every day. Despite the critical conditions in the camp, Coleman continued to use corporal punishment until April 13th, just 2 days before his release. She was assigned to barracks number 22, where Hungarian women surviving mass transit were housed at the time. She wore a regular brown uniform, black boots, and a whip hung down from her belt. On April 15, 1945, British troops under Brigadier General Glyn Hughes entered Bergen-Belsen. In view of the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe that was discovered, all SS personnel in the camp were immediately arrested. Coleman, along with other supervisors, was arrested and sent to a prison in Cell to be questioned by British intelligence. A search of her belongings revealed a handwritten piece of paper with the names and numbers of the prisoners who had been punished, as well as the surveillance duties block by block. These documents became important evidence, as they reflected the systematization of her violent behavior and her active role in the administrative apparatus of the camp. At the Belsen trial, held in Lüneburg from September to November 1945, Coleman was one of the main 45 defendants. 8 female survivors testified against her, all identifying her as a direct perpetrator of corporal punishment, a participant in forced displacement, and a perpetrator of violence that continued until shortly before her release. These testimonies were corroborated by other documents from the camp, death records, and documents found in her belongings. The prosecution focused on proving that her conduct was not accidental or sporadic, but was part of the structure of the camp's internal system of repression. Coleman did not deny beating the prisoners but insisted that he did so to maintain order in a chaotic situation. She claimed that she had never had murderous intent and was not directly involved in the execution. She admitted that the conditions in the camp were inhumane, but insisted that the blame lay with the senior commanders. However, the court ruled that her violence, by its regularity, intensity, and persistence, constituted a war crime in accordance with international law and jurisdiction applicable to crimes committed in prisoner of war camps. On November 17, 1945, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She served her sentence in the prison of Reich under British control. In 1951, he was released early as part of a policy of reducing the punishment of inmates classified as responsible for small crimes in relation to direct executions and senior commanders. She lived in seclusion for decades afterwards. She never appeared in court again and never attended any public appearances related to her past. Her figure remained in the shadows until it was identified in declassified records in the 80s. Since then, her name has reappeared in academic and judicial investigations as one of the most egregious examples of routine physical violence by SS female personnel in the last months of the Third Reich. Irma Grese, the beautiful beast of Nazi hell. Irma Ida Ilse Grese symbolizes her complete transformation from a young girl from the German countryside to a Nazi jailer, most notorious for her extreme youth and systematic cruelty. Born on October 7, 1923, in Vregen, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, she grew up in a family of dairy farmers, and because her father was an ardent member of the National Socialist Party, she was indoctrinated with Nazi ideology as a natural part of her education from an early age. At the age of 14, she joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, where she was systematically indoctrinated in Nazi nationalist principles, absolute obedience to the state, and sacrifice of personal interests for the sake of the German national community. Her attempts to become a nurse were unsuccessful, and she was rejected by the German Red Cross and others, so she quit school at the age of 15. In 1942, at the age of 18, she was recruited as an apprentice in the women's camp system at Ravensbrück. He underwent 6 weeks of intensive training, which trained him in surveillance, corporal punishment, the hierarchical structure of the SS, and the mentality to carry out systematic violence without moral hesitation. She showed extraordinary abilities with absolute obedience, the ability to punish without mercy, and total devotion to the goals of the system. These qualities accelerated her promotion. In March 1943, he was assigned to Auschwitz, first to the camp and then to Birkenau. In 1944, at the age of 21, she was appointed senior superintendent, Oberaufseherin, supervising hundreds of prisoners and auxiliaries, becoming one of the youngest women in the camp system to reach such authority. In Auschwitz, the selection of deportees was actively carried out on railway ramps, where SS doctors decided their fate, temporary forced labor or immediate gassing. Her participation was directly responsible for the lives and deaths of thousands. According to records during her service, she participated in a selection that led to the murder of about 30,000 female prisoners during their deportation from Hungary in the summer of 1944. Her violent means were characteristic and systematic. She used a whip woven from hides, sometimes a whip reinforced with wire, to punish such trivial infractions as moving or talking loudly during roll call. Military boots with metal nails were used to beat him in the abdomen, legs, and back. One survivor testified that she kicked a pregnant woman so brutally that the victim bled profusely and lost her child and her life. The German Shepherd, assigned as official equipment, became her most formidable tool. She deliberately trained the dog to attack the prisoners, regularly inciting attacks by the dog against anyone who fell out of line, stumbled during the march, or simply got in the way during a display of power. The bite was either a direct wound or an infection that could not be treated for its sequelae and was often fatal. At the time of the inspection, he was carrying a handgun, but there is no record of him firing at the prisoner. She used it for psychological intimidation, such as beating her with the butt of a gun during public punishment or threatening her with a partial sword in a disciplinary confrontation. Her presence was characterized by rigor, meticulousness, and obsessive discipline, maintaining a perfect military posture and being extremely strict with the guards of her subordinates. Some of the phrases she often used in public punishment included, Discipline keeps order and disobedience means death, reflecting her personal adherence to the camp's ideology and her conviction that extreme violence was a necessary means of maintaining control. There is no mention in the records that a single act of mercy was performed during her service. She had a close relationship with high-ranking medical officials, especially Joseph Mengele, who was in charge of criminal experiments and sorting into gas chambers. Administrative documents record her presence with Mengele during at least 18 selection proceedings in the fall of 1944. She served as an advisor to determine the capacity to work and to send them directly to the gas chambers, and her opinion was especially important in the case of sick and emaciated prisoners. In March 1945, the Soviet invasion of Auschwitz forced the removal of the camp. Grese accompanied the final transport of thousands of female prisoners to the interior of Germany, where they were deported to Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen, which had already collapsed due to overpopulation and typhus epidemics, became the final stage of her career, where she continued her violent methods until the arrival of British troops. On 15 April 1945, he was arrested along with a staff member who had not been able to escape from Bergen-Belsen and was charged at the Belsen trial in Lüneburg, September to November 1945. 27 witnesses testified unequivocally against her, including survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, as well as captured auxiliaries who worked under her authority. The evidence included an affidavit identifying her as an active participant in the screening of the gas chambers, a coherent account of whip use and systematic dog attacks, a medical report on injuries consistent with her habitual punishment, and photographs containing official documents signed by her as supervisor. She did not deny beating prisoners or participating in the sorting, but claimed that she acted under direct orders, saying that she did not intend for the individual to die. Her defense focused on arguing that her job was simply to maintain order and that she had never opened fire on prisoners or voluntarily ordered executions. On November 17, 1945, she was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to be hanged along with Elisabeth Volkenrath and Juana Bormann. Her execution was carried out by Albert Pierrepoint on December 13, 1945, in a prison in Hamelin. He was 22 years old at the time of execution, making him one of the youngest war criminals executed by the Allied tribunals, ending the life of a man who used his youth as an instrument of terror for the Nazi extermination machine. Fire trials, the final verdict at the gallows in Hamelin. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen, April 15, 1945, revealed the circumstances that led the British authorities to organize one of the first war crimes trials and establish the norms of international justice. The discovery of 10,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 critically ill survivors called for an immediate judicial response that would serve as a model for subsequent trials. The Belsen Tribunal was established under the jurisdiction of the British Military Tribunal in Lüneburg and was chosen for its proximity to the camp and the availability of appropriate judicial facilities. The authorities considered it essential to hold a trial on German territory in order to establish a direct link between the crime and the consequences and to show that justice would reach the perpetrators in the same place where it was carried out. The trial took place from September 17 to November 17, 1945, presided over by Lieutenant Colonel R.F. Scott with the participation of a professional military prosecutor and duly appointed defense attorneys. The legal framework is the British Army's War Crimes Act, a law specifically designed to prosecute those responsible for atrocities against prisoners of war and civilians in occupied territories. The law made it possible to try crimes against humanity without the need for direct evidence of intent to commit individual crimes and provided that involvement in a criminal organization was sufficient evidence to determine a conviction. This principle acknowledged that the camps functioned as collective criminal enterprises in which each participant contributed to the final outcome, regardless of his or her rank. Of the 45 defendants, 16 were SS members serving in Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. A substantial proportion of this clearly recognized that responsibility for Nazi crimes included the active participation of women in the system of extermination and challenged conventional notions of gender roles in organized violence. The principal defendants were Irma Grese, Elisabeth Valkenrath, and Juana Bormann, with multiple witnesses pointing to the murders, organized assaults, and involvement in the sorting of gas chambers as directly responsible. The other defendants included Anneliese Coleman, Hertha Erlt, Ilse Rother, and Gerd Beauté, each facing specific charges based on first-hand testimony and documentary evidence. The judicial process was characterized by rigor in the presentation of evidence and the verification of testimony. The rules allowed for the authorization of oral testimony supported by additional sources, affidavits verified by cross-examination, official documents including written orders and administrative records, and recovered physical evidence such as whips, uniforms, and weapons used by personnel. The methodology stipulated that it was not necessary to prove the intent of individual crimes, but to show knowledge and involvement in a system designed to commit crimes against humanity. Each defendant had time to counsel, interpret if necessary, and present witnesses for rebuttal. But due to the overwhelming evidence, the defense focused on disobedience to orders and denial of knowledge of the consequences. The 3 women sentenced to death were identified by multiple witnesses as responsible for the most serious crimes: direct involvement in killings, deaths through systematic torture, deliberate involvement in sorting gas chambers, and long-term maintenance of these behaviors in multiple camps. The court considered that the level of cruelty, hierarchical status, duration of the criminal act, and the size of the victim justified the death penalty. The verdict was handed down on November 17, 1945, shortly after the adjournment of the trial. The executions were scheduled in the prison of Hamelin, a German facility converted by the British authorities to house prisoners of war and prisoners of the Nazi regime, and were chosen for their ability to accommodate multiple executions and the location being accessible to British soldiers. The execution on December 13, 1945 was carried out by Albert Pierre Point, the official executioner of Great Britain, who was developing a long-range fall system to guarantee instant death from a fracture of the cervical vertebrae. His method followed a standardized procedure: individual movements from the cell recording height and weight for an accurate calculation of the length of the rope, placement in steel trapdoors, execution by actuation of a lever. The gallows in Hamelin allowed for the simultaneous execution of up to 3 people, but on that day they were carried out individually to ensure technical accuracy. Irma Grese was executed at 9:34, Elisabeth Valkenrath at 9:40, and Juana Bormann at 9:45. According to records, each fall took between 11 and 16 seconds from the time the trapdoor opened until Capt V.R.T. Hovenden, the court's official physician, confirmed the death. A total of 13 people were executed that morning. This includes Josef Kramer, commander of Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen. The complete document is preserved in the British archives. These include medical reports proving instant death from a fractured cervical vertebrae, Pierre Point calculation sheets, photographs of uniforms and personal belongings, and testimonies from prison guards and military priests. The bodies were buried in mass graves under strict secrecy, without individual markings or official ceremonies. No official statement was made, and the entire operation was recorded as an official mission under the control of the British War Office. The documents were classified for 40 years, declassified in 1985, and kept in the British National Archives under reference number W0309/444. The Belsen trials established a lasting legal precedent that influenced Nuremberg and the Nazi dismantling process that followed. The participation of women as prime defendants showed that criminal liability for genocide was not limited by gender, and established that women could be equally held accountable for crimes against humanity if they voluntarily participated in the extermination system. Judicial methods that emphasized participation in collective crime enterprises over individual responsibility for specific acts became a model for trials against perpetrators of genocide. The court established that knowledge of the consequences of the crime and voluntary continued participation were sufficient evidence for a conviction regardless of the claim of obedience to the order. The executions were the first cases in which women were specifically executed for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and established a precedent that women who participated in genocide would be tried to the same standards as male perpetrators, without special consideration of women's nature and propensity for violence based on gender stereotypes. The process, which took 8 months from release to execution, became a model of judicial efficiency that balanced the need for prompt justice with the requirements of due process. Its speed reflected the Allied urgency to establish immediate consequences for the crimes discovered, as well as the overwhelming availability of evidence that facilitated convictions. The testimony provided complete judicial documentation on the inner workings of the camps, particularly the role of women in the day-to-day operations of the extermination system. The statement revealed the methods of torture, the sorting system into the gas chambers, living conditions, the hierarchical structure that allowed the efficient functioning of the Nazi death machine. For the first time, international media coverage brought first-hand images and testimonies of the realities of the camps to viewers around the world and contributed significantly to public knowledge of the scope and nature of the Holocaust. Photographs of the court, photographs of the defendants and transcripts of testimony were widely published and had a lasting influence on public opinion regarding German responsibility. The specific cases of the executed guards showed that the documented extreme cruelty could not be explained as a result of male orders imposed on reluctant women, but reflected the voluntary and enthusiastic participation of women who fully accepted Nazi ideology and saw the opportunity to wield absolute power over defenseless victims within the camp system. The execution of December 13, 1945, marked the end of the career of a criminal who was involved in the deaths of tens of thousands of prisoners in multiple camps. Their punishment was a measure of justice for survivors and a warning about the inevitable consequences of involvement in crimes against humanity for future perpetrators. The legacy of the Belsen trials continues to influence contemporary international justice on war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Established principles are incorporated into international treaties, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, and national laws dealing with criminal liability of individuals for genocide and participation in systems of state violence.